The morning Marcus signed the papers, the snow was coming down the way it does in late February in Hamilton. Not the kind that sticks, but the kind that melts the second it touches the pavement. So by the time he walked out of the family court building on Main Street West, his coat was just damp enough to feel like the city itself was wringing him out. He stood on the steps and looked at the parking lot. Diane had taken the Subaru. He'd known she would. What he hadn't quite accounted for was standing on those steps in the slush with a plastic folder of court documents and no way home except the 5 bus. He was 41 years old. He had a folder. He had a bus to catch. That's where this story starts. Not with the helicopter, not with the woman in the gray coat who would walk into his life 9 months later, but here on these wet concrete steps, with his younger daughter, Blythe's voice in his head from the night before asking, "Daddy, are we going to have to move?" He hadn't known what to tell her. He'd said they were going to be just fine. He wasn't sure he'd believed it. You should know something about Marcus Adeyemi before we go any further. He wasn't a man who complained. His mother, who'd come from Lagos to Brampton in 1987 with $60 and a cousin's phone number, had raised him with a particular economy of suffering. You felt what you felt, and then you got up and you managed. It wasn't coldness. It was just the understanding that the world wasn't structured around your grief, so you had better not structure everything around it either. He'd carried that into his marriage, into his work, into the way he'd built his shop. Maybe too far into the marriage, if he was being honest. He'd been told as much, more than once, by the mediator and by Diane, and eventually by his own sister Kezia, who had sat at his kitchen table the previous October and said, "Marcus, you don't let anybody in. You just fix things quietly and wonder why no one notices." He'd fixed things quietly for 19 years. The shop was called Adeyemi Custom Woodwork, and it sat on a commercial strip in the east end of Hamilton in a building he'd been renting since 2014. The kind of building with old industrial windows and a persistent smell of sawdust that never fully left the walls. He made furniture, custom pieces mostly, dining tables, bookshelves, the occasional kitchen cabinet. He was good at it in the way that people are good at things when they've spent 20 years paying close to 10. His hands knew the grain of wood the way some people know the sound of their children's breathing, instinctively, without looking. The settlement had given Diane the house in Westdale, the family van, and the joint savings account, which had held just under $40,000. What Marcus kept, a 2009 Honda Civic with a slow leak in the rear left tire, and primary care of their 2 daughters, Blythe, who was 9, and Harriet, who was 12, and had already developed the quiet, watchful look of someone processing more than she was saying. This was not a bad outcome, technically. Marcus knew it. His lawyer had told him so 3 times in slightly different ways. He'd walked into that marriage with the shop, and he was walking out with it. But the savings were gone, the income that had been split between 2 earners was now 1. And school would keep costing what school costs in Ontario, and groceries were what groceries were. And the slow tire needed fixing. And Blythe had asked that morning about hockey registration, whether she could still play, and he'd said yes because he couldn't say anything else to her face. He took the bus home. The apartment was on Charlton Avenue East, a second-floor unit in a duplex, 3 bedrooms, decent light, a radiator that clanked on cold nights. He'd found it in November and moved in before Christmas, while the girls stayed in the house with Diane until school let out in June. That was the arrangement. A good arrangement, everyone agreed, civilized. Marcus had packed his half of the house into 14 boxes and driven it over in 2 trips in Kezia's truck. And he'd stood in the empty apartment that first night with a sleeping bag and a bag of takeout from the Lebanese place on Lock Street. And he'd eaten his shawarma in the quiet and thought about what he was going to do now. What he'd done was work. He took every order that came in. He worked Saturdays. He stayed late on Tuesday and Thursday nights while the girls were with Diane. And he was home every time by 6:30 on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday when they were with him. He didn't miss a single school pickup. He made lunches every morning. He learned, slowly and with a certain amount of trial and error, to do Harriet's braids in a way that met with her approval, which was not a low bar. And he sat with Blythe at the kitchen table every Tuesday after school to do multiplication tables, which she hated, and he hated too. But they did them together, and he made her laugh by getting them wrong on purpose, and she corrected him, and it became something. He didn't talk about the money. Not to the girls, not to clients. He called his mother every Sunday night, and when she asked how things were, he said they were managing. He wasn't lying. They were managing. But managing and fine are not the same thing, and by September, 7 months after the courthouse steps, Marcus was doing the accounting in the back of the shop on a Friday night and looking at numbers that were beginning to move in a direction he didn't like. He had a bid in on a contract with a property developer, a company called Sutherland Group, which was putting up a boutique hotel in downtown Hamilton and wanted custom wood paneling for the lobby and the restaurant on the second floor. It was the largest contract Marcus had ever bid on. If he got it, it would carry the shop through the better part of the next year. He'd spent 2 weeks on the proposal. He'd priced it carefully, estimated the labor, built in a reasonable margin. He'd presented it to the Sutherland Group's procurement team in August in a boardroom on King Street. With samples, he'd brought in a flat-topped wooden crate he'd made himself. The procurement team had been polite. They'd said they'd be in touch. That was 6 weeks ago. He was starting to think they weren't going to be in touch. You have to have a backup plan, his mother said on Sunday night over the phone. He told her he was working on it. What does working on it mean? It means I'm thinking. She was quiet for a moment. His mother's silences were not empty. They were full of the particular patience of a woman who had done hard things and knew that hard things took time and didn't require commentary. Call Kezia, she said. She knows people. He didn't call Kezia. Kezia would help, and then she would check in. And he wasn't ready for the checking in. He told himself he'd wait 1 more week on the Sutherland contract. 1 more week came and went. He was in the shop on a Wednesday morning in October, the 3rd week of October, the kind of morning when Hamilton's industrial East End is doing its best impression of somewhere grim. The sky the color of old concrete, the smell of Lake Ontario in the air, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He'd gotten into the habit of not answering numbers he didn't know. It was usually someone trying to sell him something. But there was something about the stillness of the shop at 9 in the morning, with sawdust floating in the strip of light from the high window, that made him pick up. Is this Marcus Adeyemi? It was a woman's voice. Measured, not unfriendly. The kind of voice that was used to being taken seriously without needing to ask for it. He said it was. My name is Celeste Ward. I'm the Director of Property Development at Sutherland Group. I'd like to come and see the shop if you're open to that. Marcus looked around the shop. There was sawdust on everything. There was a half-finished bookcase leaning against the wall. The radio in the corner was playing something from the 90s. He said yes, he was open to that. Tomorrow morning? Say 10 o'clock? He said that worked. She said she'd see him then, and she hung up. He stood with his phone in his hand for a moment. Then he went and found the broom. Celeste Ward arrived at 2 minutes past 10 in a car that suggested she was not accustomed to the East End's parking situation, a black Lexus SUV that she left on the street in front of the shop as though she'd decided the city owed her the space. She was in her mid-40s, Marcus guessed, with the kind of composure that comes not from ease but from having navigated difficulty so many times that you've stopped being rattled by it. She wore a gray coat over a dark blazer. No jewelry except small gold earrings. She shook his hand and looked at the shop the way someone looks at a thing when they're genuinely trying to understand it. She looked at the bookcase. She looked at the bookcase. You made that, she said. He said he had. He told her it was a custom piece, cherry with dovetail joints, for a client in Ancaster. She walked over and ran her hand along the side of it, following the grain with her fingers. Marcus had had clients do that before. It was the instinct people had when wood was done right, the need to touch it. But most of them did it with the enthusiasm of people who liked furniture. Celeste did it with the focus of someone running a calculation. I looked at your proposal again last night, she said. I told our procurement team I wanted to make the decision myself. They weren't thrilled about that. Marcus said he could imagine. She turned and looked at him directly. Why did you build your samples out of ash? It wasn't the question he'd expected. He told her because the hotel's design schematics showed a lot of natural light in the lobby, and ash had a reflectivity that worked well in that context. It didn't compete with the light, it moved with it. He'd done some tests. He could show her the samples. She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. The procurement team went with a supplier out of Mississauga, she said. Larger operation, established relationship. You know how it goes. He did know how it went. His stomach dropped the way it had on the courthouse steps, not dramatically, not with noise, just a quiet internal rearrangement of expectations. But I'm not here about the hotel, she said. He waited. I'm building something else, she said, a residential project. 12 custom homes on the escarpment. Private buyers, significant budgets. I want each interior to feel distinct. Not like a developer did them. Like someone actually lived there and cared about the materials. She pulled a folder from the bag she was carrying. She opened it on his work table without asking. not rudely, just with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time for ceremony. Inside were architectural drawings. Marcus looked at them without picking them up. He looked at the room proportions, the ceiling heights, the placement of windows. "I'm looking for a primary woodworker," she said. "For the millwork, the built-ins, the staircase in 3 of the units. It would be an 18-month engagement with the potential to extend if the buyers are happy." Marcus looked up from the drawings. "Why me?" he said. She seemed to appreciate that he'd asked. "Because you explained the ash," she said. "The other 3 people I met with showed me their portfolios. You showed me how you think. He should tell you what happened inside him when she said that." Nothing dramatic. No relief that broke open. No tears. Nothing cinematic. Just a long, slow exhale of something he'd been holding since February, since the courthouse steps, since the bus ride home, since standing in the empty apartment with a sleeping bag. The recognition that someone who could afford to choose anyone had looked at what he'd built and decided it was worth choosing. "I'd need to understand the timeline," he said. "Of course, and I have 2 daughters. School pickup is non-negotiable on certain days." She didn't flinch. "I have a son in grade 9, she said. "I build pickups into the calendar." He looked at the drawings again. His hands, which had spent 20 years learning wood, were already thinking about the staircase in Unit 4. "I'll need to see the sites," he said. "I'll take you on Friday." This is the part of the story where I want you to understand something. This wasn't a rescue. Celeste Ward was not a billionaire swooping in to save a struggling man. Though if you looked at the spreadsheet, the math of it might look that way from a certain angle. What she was, in fact, was a developer who'd grown tired of projects that looked expensive and felt hollow. She'd spent 15 years building things people forgot about the second they sold. She didn't want to build things like that anymore. She wanted to build things that held. And Marcus Adeyemi was the person she'd found who could tell her why ash moved with the light. They weren't so different, actually. She'd built her company after her marriage ended, earlier, messier than Marcus's, with a custody arrangement that had cost her 2 years and most of her savings and had left her with sole responsibility for her son Phelan, who was now 15 and tall and quiet and spent his weekends playing chess online and reading sci-fi novels and who was, in Celeste's opinion, the most interesting person she knew. She'd built Sutherland Group from a 1-person consultancy in a Oakville co-working space into a company with 12 employees and 23 completed projects across southern Ontario. She'd done it the way Marcus had done his shop, by paying close attention, by not complaining, by caring about the thing more than most people thought was warranted. She hadn't told any of this to the procurement team. The sites were on the Lincoln-Alexander Parkway corridor, where the escarpment dropped away and you could see the city below and the lake beyond it, gray and enormous and absolutely indifferent to whatever was happening in anyone's life. Marcus stood on the lot for the first unit and looked at the views and thought about what the staircases needed to be in a house that had a view like this. Not to compete with the view, to invite toward it. He thought about Blythe asking if they were going to have to move. He thought about Harriet doing her homework at the kitchen table without saying anything while he made dinner. He drove back to the shop that afternoon and sat at the work table for a long time without doing anything. Then he called his mother. "The call from Sutherland came," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't know. I haven't told you anything yet. I know you, Marcus." Her voice was the same voice it had always been. A little arch, a little warm, absolutely certain. Whatever they offered, you thought about the girls before you decided. He hadn't told her about the conversation yet. He hadn't described Celeste or the architectural drawings or the staircase in Unit 4, but she was right. The way she was usually right about the things that mattered. He had stood on that escarpment lot and thought about Blythe's hockey registration and whether Harriet needed new winter boots and what kind of school year they were going to have. He told his mother the details. The 18 months, the 12 houses, the potential to extend. There was a pause that wasn't really a pause, more like the half-second of breath before someone says something they've already known they were going to say. "Well," she said, "then you'd better do a good job." The contract was signed in the first week of November. Marcus hired 2 apprentices from the trades program at Mohawk College, a second-year student named Dominic who was precise and methodical, and reminded Marcus a little of himself at 20, and a young woman named Vera who was fast and confident and made design decisions without being asked, some of which were wrong and some of which were better than what Marcus would have chosen. He liked her immediately. He started with the staircase in Unit 4. The wood he chose was white oak. He'd been thinking about it since the lot visit. The way the view from that unit moved through the room, the quality of the afternoon light. White oak had a warmth without being obvious about it. It didn't announce itself. It just sat in the room and made everything around it feel more considered. He worked on the design for 2 evenings at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed, with his reading glasses on and graph paper covered in measurements. And he thought about how it felt to know what you were doing. Really know it, in your hands and not just your head. Harriet came out for a glass of water one of those evenings and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the drawings. "What is that?" she said. He told her. He explained the project, the 12 houses, the escarpment. She sat down across from him without being invited, and looked at the drawings with the same watchful expression she'd been wearing since February. The ones that said she was taking in more than she was showing. She asked a few questions, practical ones, about timeline, about the apprentices, about whether they were going to have to move to the apartment in September the way they'd originally discussed. He told her they were not going to have to move. She nodded, once the way her grandmother nodded, economically, without making it a moment. "Good," she said, and she went back to bed. He sat there at the kitchen table with the graph paper for a while longer. The radiator clanked once, the way it always did at this hour. The apartment was quiet in the particular way apartments are quiet when the people you love are asleep down the hall. He thought about the courthouse steps in February, about the bus ride home, about Celeste Ward, looking at the bookcase and following the grain with her fingers, running the calculation. "Why me?" "Because you explained the ash." He put the cap back on his pen and folded the graph paper carefully and tucked it into the folder he'd been keeping for the project. He turned off the kitchen light. He went and checked on both girls, Blythe first, who was asleep with her arm around a stuffed seal she'd had since she was 4 and still refused to retire, and Harriet second, who was asleep with her reading light still on and a novel face down on her chest. He turned off the light. He left the door open a crack. It did not feel like winning. He wasn't sure he had a word for what it felt like. Not winning, not rescue, something quieter than both. Something that felt maybe like being correctly understood. The first staircase took 6 weeks. Celeste came to see it when it was done, before the finishing coat was applied. That moment when the wood was fully shaped but still raw, the joints cut and fitted but not yet sealed. She stood at the bottom of the staircase and looked up, and then she walked up it slowly, one hand on the railing, not holding it, just touching it, like the bookcase. Like someone checking whether the thing was true. She turned around at the top and looked down at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Unit 7, she said, has a vaulted ceiling in the library. I want to talk about built-ins." He said he was listening. She came down the stairs and they sat on the subfloor of the empty living room with the architectural drawings between them and talked about wood and light for the better part of an hour. Outside, the escarpment dropped away to the city. Somewhere below, Blythe was at school learning multiplication tables, and Harriet was writing a history essay that she'd shown him a paragraph of, and which was frankly better than anything he'd written in high school. The lake was out there past the city, the same gray and enormous lake it always was. Marcus Adeyemi looked at the drawings and started talking about the ceiling in Unit 7, and what he thought the wood needed to do in a room that tall. He was pretty sure he knew exactly what it needed to do. He'd been paying attention for 20 years.